Have been eagerly awaiting the whole day for Agneta Sutton to present. And Agneta has a long connection with the center here, has been involved with the journal Ethics in Medicine for many years. She was a researcher with the Linacre Center, the one that is now the Anscombe Center, and she's currently a lecturer at University College Chichester.
No.
Not anymore?
No, actually, I'm not. I am at Heythrop College, which is a college at the University of London.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So, but we're just here to hear what you have to say on this topic of the theological and ethical issues around cytoplasmic transfer and Blastomere nuclear transfer.
Yes. So I will speak about two technologies. Blastomere nuclear transfer is one technology that's similar in aim to the one that Trevor was discussing, insofar as the aim is to produce a child free of mitochondrial disease. The technique aims to overcome maternal mother-to-child transmission of the disease. The other technology I'm talking about is cytoplasmic transfer, and that one has been suggested it might be used for that purpose. It has been used in reality to promote fertility in women, more elderly mothers to be. What I'll do, I'll first of all explain the technologies, and then I will try to outline 3 Christian principles in the light of which to evaluate them. So these are the 3 principles, actually. We must not treat the child, born or unborn, as if it were a mere commodity of only instrumental value to us. The techniques, and sorry, I can't understand this, sorry. Does it not start at the beginning? I'm very sorry, this is something gone wrong here. Okay, that's why I thought it was a bit odd. Okay, so, okay, it started in the middle, that's why I got confused. Anyway, I'll talk about these 2 techniques, and I will speak about them unashamedly from a Christian point of view, as here I know I have a non-hostile audience. So I'm going to talk about the ethical issues. I'm not going to talk very much about medical risk or the issues related to IVF in general or to the issues related to donation. I try to focus on the issues that are more specific to these particular techniques. But I'm very much concerned with the issue of human dignity. How do they affect human dignity, and how do they affect human relationships, and even how do they affect human relation to God? So that's my remit. Yes, and to explain this technology, it's very similar to ordinary cloning, the cloning used for, cloning Dolly the sheep. But instead of using a somatic cell, the nucleus from a somatic cell, to transfer to an enucleated egg, we take a nucleus from an embryo. Okay, that's the difference. And so I'll explain it in more detail in a minute. I couldn't get a good picture, unfortunately. I Googled for hours, but I couldn't get one. So I have a surrogate picture. And anyway, so what happens? You create an IVF embryo from the intending mother, the mother with the disease. But you don't want her, obviously, to pass on a disease. So that's why we do this. And after 5 days, when you have this embryo at the blastocyst stage, you'll have all these cells, blastomeres, genetically identical cells. And it's those we're after, actually. And they're those we're going to use for constructing an egg, an embryo that is free of the disease. So here we have just a 5-day-old blastocyst. That's the sort of picture I could find. But I couldn't find a picture for, so gosh, I don't. Anyway, I was hoping this would. I was instead of. I was hoping to have a picture there of a blastocyst. So consider them as little blastocysts that I've already separated from the actual blastocyst. So these are blastomere cells from the blastocyst. And what I do, I have an enucleated egg, and I just transfer the nucleus from the blastocyst into there. So effectively, I destroy the original IVF embryo, and I use a number of donor eggs that have been enucleated to create an embryo that is free of the disease. Have you got it, even though I haven't got a good picture? Okay. And so I say the nucleus of each of these blastomeres from this original blastomere blastocysts are then extracted and transferred into an enucleated egg. And obviously that's from a donor free of the disease. So you get a mother with the intending mother's nuclear DNA. And that's what I say, that's the important part. That's what, the NAFL Council and the HFA say, that's the important part. The mitochondria is not so important for the genetic identity that I say of the embryo, but of course it is. And the father of this embryo, of course, or the embryos, because in fact you will be creating several, because from each, you can use each blastomere and so you could have 10, create 20 embryos that are genetically identical. Genetically identical if the egg donor is the same. Obviously, you have several egg donors, it's not going to be genetically identical. But so, and the father obviously is the man who fertilized the original embryo, the maternal, intending mother's embryo. Okay, that's the technology. So it will involve destruction of the original embryo and, of course, the eggs. But I'm not, worried about any, what shall I say, side effects of that from a medical point of view. What I'm going to discuss are what are the implications for intergenerational relations. So cytoplasmic transfer is just very much simpler. All you do is you have an egg here from the intending mother, and you just add cytoplasm from a donor oocyte egg. And they say it might possibly help to avoid maternal transmission of the disease. I think that's doubtful, but I'm not a scientist. So, but they certainly are using it in some countries to improve fertility, so they think more elderly mothers. Okay, so there are certain medical effects that are adverse that I have noticed that NAFL Council does speak about Turner syndrome, in two offspring, and yes, I'll leave that. I'm not going to bother with the medical. So the question is, what are the main issues beside IVF and beside the issue of donation? I'm not dealing with that either because other people have already done that. So, but from a Christian understanding, are there other issues? And I think there are. So I say a Christian understanding of human dignity, actually I think we must derive that from our understanding in Jesus Christ as God incarnate. I mean, because in Jesus, God literally united himself with humankind. And not only that, he literally was born of a woman, Mary. So he must have started his life as an embryo in a human womb. And I say that therefore that bestows a special dignity not only on the adult human being, But even on the embryo, if Jesus Christ himself was a human embryo at one stage. So, and of course, anyway, I don't think anyone can deny that the human embryo is a human being, because it's a being, it's alive, and it is of human origin. So whether you want to call it a person or not, it's certainly a human being. I would say it's a person with potential rather than a potential person, but be that as it may. So I say that by uniting himself with us, Jesus bestowed a dignity not only on us more mature humans, but even on the human embryo, on the fetus itself, because he took, he started life himself in that way. So that gives us, I think, a first principle that we must not treat the child, born or unborn, and even the embryo, as if it were a mere commodity of only instrumental value to us. So that's my first principle in the light of which to judge the two technologies of which I'm speaking. And then on a Christian understanding, of course, we all created in the image of God. Some people know more about it than I. And we also think of life as a gift from God. And I think the understanding of giftedness is a very important aspect of the child. And as I said, the giftedness comes to the fore, for instance, in this account of, in Genesis 4, where we read that Eve said that, she conceived a child with the help of God. And by saying that, she recognizes, she said conceived or produced a man with the help of the Lord. The different translations or different wordings in different Bibles, as you know. But one way or the other, she recognizes the child as one of us, a member of the human family, a neighbor. And she recognizes that it is a gift from God at the same time as it is the product of human mating, put it that way, of human action as well. So, and then I would like to refer you to this passage where Jesus welcomes the children. And I think that is very clear that on that understanding, we should treat the child as a neighbor and welcome the child as a neighbor. I mean, he gave the child a total unconditional welcome. And I think that we do show that, we do something similar when we baptize a child. We welcome it totally and unconditionally into our Christian community. And I think likewise we should welcome the child, the gift of life, unconditionally into our human community. Welcome it as a neighbor among us. So I think that gives me the second principle. The child should be treated as a neighbor and given an unconditional welcome as a gift from God, or as a gift from God. So, and then I looked at another passage which I think is very, very important, but Jesus told us to serve one another. You remember in the Gospel of John, at the Passover, at the feast, Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. And he said, that you should serve one another as servants of God. Peter had problems with that, but Jesus explained that unless he did that, he could not be one of his true disciples. So what he meant was that we should serve our neighbor, another of us, as servants of God. We should, at the same time as we should serve the child or a neighbor, we should do so in a spirit recognizing God as the master. So we should not recognize ourselves as master. We should recognize ourselves as servants of God while serving our neighbor. And as already, if you already accept then that the child is a neighbor, which I've done on my reasoning so far, that would give us a third principle, that we should serve and love our children as servants of God. Or better still, that we should not try to assume the sort of attitude of God towards our children, but we should serve them as servants of God, because God is the master. We are servants of God. And so we should not try to usurp God's role in the situation. So I have three principles, in other words. We must not treat the child, born or unborn, as if it were a mere commodity of only instrumental value to us. And when I say child, born or unborn, I even mean the embryo or fetus. The child should be treated as a neighbor and given an unconditional welcome as a gift from God. And we should not try to act as God vis-a-vis our children. We should serve and love our children as servants of God. So let us then look at Blastomere nuclear transfer in the light of the first principle. Now, as I explained the technique, it involves the creation of an original IVF embryo, which you leave till 5 days when you actually pull it apart to put its cells into enucleated eggs. And then you sort of create what I call combi embryos, combination embryos. And you could create quite a number of them. But by doing that, you obviously treat the original embryo in a very instrumental way. And you obviously also the eggs, and even the egg donors for that matter. Because you treat the embryo in that sort of, the original embryo that sort of way, you even have an instrumental attitude towards the child to be. So I say to treat the human embryo as disposable material shows really a materialistic understanding of human life. I should say materialistic and dualistic, because you don't think of it as a being, you think of it as mere matter. And I mean, a being is more than mere matter. But I say, a human being has a transcendental dimension. We not only are created in the image of God, we're meant to return to God. And you can say that, Jesus showed us where we came from, who we are, and where we're going. And on that sort of understanding, you can't treat even the human embryo at the very beginning of life as mere matter, as just, blob. So I said, therefore, every human life, including embryonic life, deserves to be treated with respect rather than, as a product of homo faber. So, and then I take the second principle, treat the child as a neighbor and give it an unconditional welcome. Well, obviously, the Blastomere nuclear transfer that destroys the embryo and creates the child by putting bits and pieces together does not treat either the original embryo or the child to be as a neighbor. The child is treated, the embryo is treated as disposable material to be molded to design. And the child is not given an unconditional welcome, that's for sure, because it's only given a welcome on the condition that it has been molded in a certain way to overcome a certain problem. So it is created in order to meet a certain standard, which is problematic. And now I say, of course, we all want healthy children. That's obvious. We don't want sick children. So you may say, what's wrong with trying to make them healthy? Well, I have a sort of slight problem with that, because there are limits to what we should do to make ensure that our children are healthy. And you take prenatal diagnosis, I think there you select some children, you weed out some children. Obviously, the aim is to make sure that some children are not born with certain diseases, and you'll, at the end of the day, have a healthy child. But this is a destructive way of going about it. And surely that's not at all compatible with giving the child an unconditional welcome. It's given a very conditional welcome. So, and that applies both to the child that's been weaned. I mean, the child has been weaned, not given a welcome at all, but the child who's conceived and given a chance to live because nothing adverse came up on the test. That's given a conditional welcome only, effectively. So, and I say, what I worry about here, even though Blastomere nuclear transfer is made with the purpose of healing rather than the purpose of weeding out defective material, put it that way, it entails a conditional welcome only of the child. Because it's only if it lives up to a certain standard. So and in addition, of course, Blastomere nuclear transfer, as you can see, involves a deadly choice. The original embryo is destroyed. So, and in fact, I mean, if you look at the technique, I say it's triply doubly or triply selective and destructive. Because if you have the original IVF embryo, of course, there you would already have made a selection, presumably. Well, you would. You always do with IVF embryos, even if it's only by simply looking at them in a microscope. And then several donated eggs are selected and, destroyed. And then Blastomere from the original embryo selected, which means the destruction of the embryo, and then transferred. So I said there's a lot of selection and destruction in this procedure. So there's also the well, you might consider it a problem that you could have, the result could be several genetically identical children born at the same time, or perhaps not at the same time, but several years in between. And if they were born at the same time, I suppose we'd be back to the sort of ordinary, genetic twin sort of situation. Well, which that may not be very worrying. Possibly it would worry the children if they had a genetically identical sibling that was born 10 years before, 10 years after, I don't know. But whatever about that, my main worry absolutely is totally the sort of parental and medical professions' acceptance of this type of manufacture of a child that meets certain standards. And it's a manufacture that's partly destructive. That's my concern. So but the issue for me are the older generation's attitude to the subsequent generation. So, and then I say we should not seek to assume the role of God vis-a-vis our children, but we should love and serve them as servants of God. So, well, if you treat an embryo as mere biological material, you're not obviously loving and serving the child to be that you want to make out of that embryo somehow. And I say, but if you don't feel that the embryo is anything but a piece of matter, then obviously you may think that you have both a right and a duty to manipulate this entity to get this perfect child. You probably think, you may even think you have a duty to make it perfect. Why shouldn't you? I mean, if it's in your gift, to, so to speak, to make this healthy child from this clump you have in your hand, why shouldn't you do it? So, but I say on a Christian understanding, you can have neither such a right nor such a duty, because you cannot look upon it in that way as more material. So, obviously, as Christians, you would have to also adopt a greater humility, a degree of humility vis-a-vis the origin of human life. I mean, you can't you can't think of yourself as a Prometheus who can do what, the virtually impossible. And we know that we're limited creatures, and in a way, we should strive to better ourselves, and we should strive to have healthy children. But, we should tread carefully. So, I think we can't go down this path of treating embryos as commodities, I say. If we do that, I mean, it's going to have great effects in society, even between generations. So I don't think we can go down treating, even nascent human life as disposable material to be shaped to our design. So I would say that Blastomere nuclear transfer is not compatible with a Christian understanding of the value and dignity of human life. And certainly doesn't give the child an unconditional welcome or treat it as a neighbor. But it reflects an instrumental attitude on the part of parents and healthcare services. As for cytoplasmic transfer, well, it's much less technical, obviously, but there's still a sort of brickwork here insofar as, the end product, once you transfer a bit of cytoplasm from one egg to another, is again a combination egg, and using even the egg like this in order to promote, even for a good purpose, shows a certain instrumental attitude. But then, as I said, if the aim is just not so much to create a child free of mitochondrial disease, which is a good aim, of course, but the means are important. But if the aim is to make the mother more fertile, well, there would be problems. But the thing is, I mean, you will have an instrumental attitude there, but then arguably you can come back to me and say, well, using IVF in any way is instrumental. Any reproductive technology is instrumental, and even having children naturally, in one sense, is instrumental if you really want a child. So your argument come back to haunt you there. So they may fall a little bit flat in that respect. But treat the child as a neighbor and give it an unconditional welcome as a gift from God, on the presumption here that you're using the technology to create a child free of a mitochondrial disease. It's certainly a moot point whether the child is given an unconditional welcome, because again here you're doing something to improve the original product. The egg in this case with gem would be fertilized, but you're not giving the child a totally unconditional welcome. But it's less sort of, I suppose we worry less about it if it is an egg rather than an embryo. But even so, there is an element here of human choice and that impacts on the way on our attitude to the child. Now, that raises a question, though, whether we should accept any form of germline gene therapy. Say it doesn't destroy any embryo at all, and perhaps not even an egg, and say so it wouldn't affect women either. Say we wouldn't need women to donate eggs. I mean, because obviously that is another factor in some of these technologies that is very troublesome, I think, because women too are used as commodities or commodity producers, which is very, well, I take a distance to. Now, but I worry about germline gene therapy because, we've seen prenatal diagnosis becoming quite a widely used tool for avoiding diseases, and the list of diseases that can be detected are getting longer and longer. And in some cases, I think there have been instances of getting rid of children with perhaps not the most life-threatening or horrible diseases even. And what I fear is that once, if we perfected germline gene therapy and it became readily available, then parents may use it in the same spirit of what you might call soft and non-enforced eugenic, with a soft and non-enforced eugenic attitude. In other words, they may sort of demand that the techniques be made available to them, and all the alternative health authorities may offer it as a more or less routine technique to perfect your child. And I just, insofar as, I mean, what my fear is that, like prenatal diagnosis, which has gone down a slippery slope, we could see the scenario where germline gene therapy would go down a slippery slope in a similar way, just because, not because anyone would be forced to have these tests, do these things to the embryos or anything, or have the test in prenatal diagnosis, but because it's offered as routine and some more or less society has accepted it, and many parents have totally accepted this sort of thing as well. And I said we should not seek to assume the role of God vis-a-vis our children, but we should love and serve them as good servants. So any attempts at creating so-called designer children, I mean, where we to not only try to avoid disease, say, but to make them even more perfect than that, that certainly be a failure to appreciate the giftedness of life, and certainly not compatible with our own understanding as not all powerful creatures, but creatures dependent and with many imperfections. So, and I say it's very different for a pregnant mother to adopt a certain healthy lifestyle. I mean, if she does that in order to have a healthy child, that's perfectly okay, of course. But prenatal diagnosis will elimination of defective products or germline gene therapy in order to fabricate a perfect product that is sort of very, very different. And I think the two could well be the opposite sides of the same coin, if you see what I mean. So, so what I'm saying is, if you were to go down, certainly germline gene therapy, and even more, I mean, what I call enhancement, and there's a fine, you can perhaps draw a line between the two, but there's no sharp line in the sign there. I think we are sort of beginning to play God, as I call it. And what I'm worried about is, I'm worried about parental attitudes, I'm worried about intergenerational relations, and I'm worried generally about our sort of attitude in society, whether we would, be totally welcoming of diversity and difference, whether it would affect that, our attitudes in society totally. I think it could in the end, these sort of technologies. And of course, other people have said much the same. So thank you very much. That's